The tributes for the British soldier who was murdered in London this week continue to come in, but so do the questions about how he died. Could more have been done to find out about the suspects? And what is the relationship between Western foreign policy and radicalisation? Well, we've guests from all around the world waiting to take part in the programme. Wherever you're watching, the contact details are the same as usual. Here are some of them, including our social media contacts. But of course, if you don't jot them down, we'll have them on the screen throughout the show.
People are going to want to know.
Let's just say something.
Well, good to have your company today. Of course, we're going to keep you abreast of the situation at Stansted Airport. As Martine was saying, 2 men have been arrested, taken off a Pakistani airliner and arrested on suspicion of endangering the aircraft. It was supposed to be landing in Manchester. We'll keep you up to date with all the developments coming from Stansted Airport as we get them. In the meantime, let's start by discussing the brutal murder of a British soldier in London earlier this week. All of you will know the story. We're joined by Zubaida Limbada from connectjustice.org. That's a social justice consultancy. Dr. Sally Leavesley, a security consultant in London, and Fayez Mughal of Faith Matters, which is an organisation that looks to reduce extremism in the UK. Fayez, let's hear from you first. Was this crime this week evidence that the struggle that you and many others are fighting has much work to do?
The answer I would say to that is clearly there is work to be done and there is work that needs to continue on, but a lot has been done. A significant amount has been done to reduce a number of international threats as well as national threats to the UK, and this has been done through government, civil society organisations and a range of activists on the ground. And I think we would have been in a worse position even though there has been a terrible atrocity, a murder committed on our streets. The fact is, I think the situation would have been significantly worse if that amount of work with communities had not been done. Now, you can hardly tell in a scenario who potentially can be a threat if they are 1 or 2 individuals. Very difficult to tell, and if they continue in their lives not to leave any traces electronically or physically. So it is difficult to work out individuals in small cells like this. Nevertheless, work needs to be done, and it needs to be, I think, more focused in its approach, looking for small cells and small groups of individuals.
Sally, let's bring you in.
Yes, I think a lot has been done, and it was patently obvious with the community's response after that appalling murder how much different the community work was, even compared to 2005 when the 7/7 bombings had. There was a virtual outpouring by a number of communities that gave a lot of support and no actual reinforcement whatsoever of a very bad criminal act.
Zubaida, we can bring you in as well from Birmingham. What was your reaction when you heard not just about the murder, but the things that the suspect said while he was being filmed?
I think the first thing is that there's the immediate kind of shock of something like this. It's a shock in terms of the brutality and also kind of the shock and the fear that a community and communities tend to feel when something like this happens, because they're fearful of what reaction may happen to them, to the wider community. And like the previous 2 speakers have said, I think it's testament to the strength of feeling of the closeness of some of these communities in terms of coming together, in terms of condemning the acts, and in terms of making positive statements in terms of the work that they're doing to say that they're not going to be cowed, and they know that a lot of work needs to be done, but they're going to do it together in terms of those shared spaces.
But Zubaida and Fayez first, your heart must have sunk when you heard one of the suspects talking about his Islam faith. You must have thought, oh no, not again. We're going to have the same arguments, offer the same defences.
Well, yes, basically, yes, the answer to that is yes. But we have had, it's not just this incident clearly, not even before 9/11. The fact is, over the last 20 years, there have been a string of headlines involving, unfortunately, incidences with Muslim communities. And so every time this happens, it seems to unfortunately reinforce some of the negative stereotypes. It gives weight and credence to some of the extreme groups like the English Defence League and others. And so it's been a consistent battle. And every time the same thing or another thing relating to this community comes up, even the community itself actually is starting to say, look, how far are we going to let these issues go on, because the communities feel blackened, they feel that their standing in communities is reduced, they feel under threat, and there's a significant feeling of being under threat within Muslim communities today. And they just, I mean, we had a discussion with 20 professionals on our hate crime reporting project a couple of days ago, and it was sad to see that at least 11 of them said that if they had the opportunity to emigrate from the UK somewhere international, they'll take it. Now, if you have professionals feeling like that, there is a fear, and it's endemic within Muslim communities.
So, Beda, do you feel comfortable in the UK? Is it a society you can be a Muslim in and feel okay?
Absolutely. I feel very strongly about, in terms of stating who I am. I'm very comfortable with who I am, as are many of my friends and my Muslim colleagues as well. And I think it's part of knowing who we are within British society, that is part of, in terms of the response, the part of collective feeling. We can quite easily distance ourselves from people who use the name of Islam to carry out such a heinous attack, because this is nothing to do with Islam. This is to do with a murderous intent of cold-blooded brutality that was carried out.
You say it's got nothing to do with Islam. It has got something to do with Islam. We know at least one of the suspects spent a great deal of time at certain mosques. We know that he appeared at marches where certain radical Islamic groups appeared. I mean, I know it may not be your version of Islam, but it does have something to do with it, doesn't it?
Well, it's about kind of being smart and drawing a distinction between what a Muslim is, and also kind of who carries out something by using religious connotation, because it gives credibility and credence to their very warped version of Islam. If you notice, for example, today, the Muslim Council of Britain, Sheikh Mogra, who's an imam there in Leicester, he came out with a very strong statement in terms of attacking the barbaric attacks that took place in Woolwich, and he felt that this was a betrayal of Islam, and actually inadvertently he also mentioned it heightened tensions, because actually the impact on this is not just on on the faith itself, but on Muslims ourselves, in terms of we're really having to come out to condemn yet again something that's kind of 99.9% of Muslims will absolutely and wholly condemn.
And you're right, some British Muslims have expressed that frustration. We've also seen frustration from some Nigerians, both in the UK and in Nigeria, because one of the suspects is of Nigerian descent. Lots of Nigerians saying, don't bring us into this. This has got nothing to do with Nigeria. Now, let me pull up this message from Tamina in the UK, posting on Twitter. Let me just quickly show you this. It's a minority like you who give Muslims like me, who work hard to build interfaith relationships, a bad name. Well, that echoes what Zubaida was saying. But Sally, do we have to be realistic? And if we want to identify and stop the biggest threats with attacks like this, we have to look more at the Muslim community than we might do at other communities.
Well, I actually disagree with you when you're saying that this is a Muslim issue, because it's like a virus trying to get the Muslim community and the Muslim religion as its host. And the very act that we've seen, I think, has proven it, and it's why it hasn't got general traction with the community. There is not an anti-religious feeling going on post this, because everyone is just so shocked. If we go back to Iraq, and the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in the early 2003-4 period, Zarqawi, he was perpetrating such similar heinous acts, and I think it's been alleged that one of the suspects in this killing here was certainly cognizant in lectures at a university of Zarqawi's leadership. It was so cruel, and it looked at beheading people and gross acts against the local community as well as against the supposed Western enemies, that all were turning against it. And Zawahiri himself sent a letter to Zakawi that was intercepted that tried to pull him back, and eventually Zakawi was killed. So I think these over-gross acts of mutilation so shock people that no one relates it to a Muslim religion at all.
Sally, thank you very much for your comments. Those of you who are watching, you're very welcome to respond to what any of our guests are saying. We're live here on BBC World News. We're using the WHYS hashtag. All the other contact details are on the screen. John is watching in London. Thanks for getting in touch through our Facebook page. He says, if the British public needed a wake-up call to what extremism is doing in Syria, Libya, Iraq and Afghanistan, then this is it. And he uses that as a reason to be very wary of supporting opponents of President Assad in Syria. Now, let me introduce you to another guest. Fayez has left us just for the moment. Usama Hassan is joining us from the Quilliam Foundation, which was set up a few years ago to counter extremism within Muslims in the UK. Thank you for your time. What's your analysis of what has happened this week?
Unfortunately, this is the latest in a long pattern of Al-Qaeda-inspired violence. So it is savage and it's shocking, but it's not totally surprising. In 2007 in this country, there was a major plot to kidnap and behead a British Muslim soldier, and a number of young men from the UK are in prison for a long time for that. Also a few years ago, a radical preacher was filmed undercover in one of the mosques in this country saying British Muslim soldiers who serve in Afghanistan should be beheaded. So the Al-Qaeda English language magazine Inspire over the last couple of years has openly incited Muslims around the world, including in Western countries especially, to make homemade bombs in their kitchens and to buy knives and randomly attack non-Muslims as part of their global jihad against the West. Now, the Boston bombers took that on board and they did precisely that. There have been other attacks. A Labour MP in this country, Stephen Timms, was nearly murdered by a bright young university student who followed that incitement to the letter. And as what we need now is Muslims, especially theologians and scholars and leaders, to stop peddling messages of hate and intolerance and to deal with the arguments of Al-Qaeda head on.
So Osama, let's get you talking with Sally and Zubaydah, because what you're saying doesn't quite match up with what, say, Sally was saying. So Sally, what would you say in response to Osama?
Well, I think that when we see people having radical ideas, that's not a problem. It should be welcomed. Even very strange radical ideas, it's all just part of the richness of people working in their society. What we need to look at is what is pushing these people into the edge of behavioural violence, where they're expressing such an antagonism that they will break the law. It might be even financing terrorism. It isn't always just violent acts, but they will break the law, but they're looking towards some utopian type of society. It's a very directed decision to use their behaviour and to join this group to change the society. It really is, it's another career option, unfortunately, for every young person, regardless of faith. It's every young person's option now because of what's on the internet. So the influence may not need to be focused just on specific Islamic statements. It needs to be focused on the socialisation of children. Everyone can go on the net and suddenly see blood and horror and think, oh, that's an interesting career. We can go and kill people. But
bearing in mind what is available online via Al-Qaeda and other organisations, Zubaydah, is it realistic to think people can hold the radical ideas which Sally says are perfectly acceptable, but not switch over to applying those ideas in a violent way?
I think it's about understanding what is actually firstly out there on the internet. I mean, there's some very vile ideas that are allowed to kind of spread, which the government is not allowed to ban. So, for example, the Inspire magazine, in the same way as kind of some of the white extremist stuff as well. So that material is out there. And I do agree with Osama in terms of, in terms of taking ownership of the issue, in terms of mosques and communities taking issue. I've been working on the government's preventing violent extremism agenda for the last 4 years. I've worked in the local authority, I've worked with the police, and I've also been working on designing an interventions programme with the police and with the community for those who are at risk of extremism and radicalisation. And this is part of something called the Channel programme for people who are officially are very much at risk of terrorism. So the active steps are there. The people who are at risk are there. This is a government programme where they have invested very heavily in communities, and I think the message should be about kind of very local people taking responsibility of having partnership with communities and with police.
But I suppose the questions are better, and we'll talk about this later.
Well, I think one of the important points here is where you actually start some of the uncomfortable discussions. So you mentioned, for example, the internet. Where do you talk? Where do you have the space where you can acknowledge some of the grievances of communities? And foreign policy is one of those grievances, which sometimes is not always acknowledged in terms of being a driver towards radicalisation.
But I suppose one of the issues, and that's what I was just going to say, is sometimes communities will identify a problem, but sometimes they won't, and it's how the security services behave in order to pick up those who aren't identified by the community, which is an issue we'll talk about a little bit later on. Now, as always here on World Have Your Say, we've got colleagues up in the World's newsroom helping us understand reaction to the stories that we're discussing. Let's go there now and speak to Javid Somro from BBC Urdu and Dawood Azami from BBC's Afghan service. Gentlemen, good to see you. I wonder if you believe there's a connection between Western foreign policy and those who become radicalised in Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, they have used foreign policy as an excuse to carry out attacks, and in addition to the physical battlefield, there is another war going on, which is called the war of words. So there is a battle of ideas and clash of narratives, and there are ways and tools of spreading these messages. They promote a sense of injustice, they talk about victimhood and occupation, and they have different tools to spread their messages. Internet is one of them, word of mouth, speeches, pamphlets, booklets, CDs, DVDs, and they often use videos in which civilian casualties are shown or collateral damage is shown. So that is how they combine these pictures with words to motivate people to fight back. So there is an aspect of foreign policy or collateral damage which is used to motivate people to carry out attacks. And drones is one tool which is often used by some radical tools. And Javid Somro has been following this story today, which is a sensitive issue in Pakistan.
Yeah, I mean, before we go to the drone, I think about the attacks, a relation between the attacks and the foreign policy. I mean, so many things happened before even America or Western countries were inside Afghanistan or Iraq. Like USS Cole attack, the Nairobi embassy bombings, and 9/11 happened much before even there was a plan to get into Afghanistan or Iraq. So, I mean, there is some relation of, radicalizing a bunch of new jihadists, but those people who have a problem with a certain way of life, which don't believe in pluralism, who believe in kind of a certain ideologies, they will always fight for their aims. So saying that it is just because there is some foreign policy issues, I think it has some relevance to the matter, but it's not entirely. Even if you were not fighting, or the Western countries were not fighting in Afghanistan or Iraq, there was a possibility those attacks still happen. On the drone thing about the United States, President Obama's speech has been welcomed in Pakistani government, but the new government in waiting of Muslim League sorry?
Javid, I don't know who was speaking to you, but either way, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thanks also to Dawood. We'll come back to them in just a moment. Lots of you are getting in touch. We've had calls and comments from Mauritius, Pakistan, Rwanda, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, Zambia. Keep them all coming. One in just from Henry in France. He's phoned up to say, I'm Nigerian. I'm surprised to see the British press calling these two men Nigerian. They were born in the UK and radicalised in the UK. Well, Henry, I can't speak for the whole press. I don't know where you've seen it, but certainly the BBC isn't suggesting these gentlemen are Nigerian. The two suspects are of Nigerian descent, but it's been widely reported that they grew up and have spent most of their lives here in the UK. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back talking about the Woolwich attacks, how they might possibly be prevented, but also looking at the wider connection, if it exists, between Western foreign policy and those who become radicalised. Back in a moment. Speak to you then.
No, I absolutely
talking about it.
Let me say something.
Well, I'm sure a lot of you saw that speech from President Obama yesterday. We'll hear some of it in a minute, but he made a very clear point. He said America has to be careful not to create more enemies. And he was talking about how America must choose very carefully how it uses drones. And of course, that's brought up an issue that's already been in the wider realm really for several days since that attack in the south of London, and that is whether we should consider there is a genuine connection between those who become radicalised, particularly some Muslims who become radicalised and turn to violence, and the Western foreign policy that some of them object to. Let's talk about this with one guest we've met already, Fires, but two who are just joining us. Cody Aidan Lackey is in Manchester. He's a former British soldier, served in Afghanistan and Bosnia, and live in Washington, D.C. is Myla Johns from a terrorism think tank. Both of you, you're very welcome. Cody, what was your reaction when you heard about this terrible attack in London? Did you imagine this kind of thing could happen because of the involvement the British have taken in Afghanistan, for instance?
When you join the army, you know that there's risks involved, but if you died in a foreign land, obviously Afghanistan, Iraq, it's devastating enough, but to happen on the streets of Britain in such a cowardly, disgraceful, disgusting way, it is abhorrent, to be honest. And anybody that supports this sort of terrorist activity needs to be deported at the first possible cause, to be honest.
And when you were in Afghanistan, did you ever consider that what you were doing there might cause some people back home to take extreme issue with what you were doing?
As a soldier, you don't choose where you're deployed. You're deployed where you're deployed. We don't pick where we fight. We fight where we're told, and we win where we fight. And like I say, the thing is, what makes it even more poignant, me sitting here now, is the fact of yesterday I was up at Lee's house, Lee Rigby, the soldier who was killed in this abhorrent, disgraceful attack. I was actually up at his house. I went up there to lay flowers. The media was all over it, and when I went to lay flowers outside his family home, I was actually invited in, and I actually hugged his mum. And I looked her square in the eye, and obviously she was inconsolable, as you can probably imagine. That woman raised him, and to lose a son on UK soil in such a disgraceful and disgusting way is, yeah. I met numerous members of his family. I met his sisters and everything, and yeah, it's really brought it home to me. And like I say, I was up there yesterday evening. I was up there again this morning. And like I say, it's beyond words. I mean, Lee Rigby is a hero, and he will be buried with full military honours, and we will honour him, and we will remember him as we will remember all our fallen. Anybody that supports this sort of ideology, if they don't like Westerners, and they don't like the way that we live, and they don't like our beliefs, and they preach hatred on our streets and death to the West and everything. These people, we should take a stand similar to Australia, and we should deport these people.
I suppose the issue, Cody, and this is, we'll talk to Myla just after the break that we've got to take, but one of the issues here that Cody's raising is whether this hatred that we've seen manifest itself in lots of different ways is just there and towards the Western world, or whether it is created or at least exacerbated by the foreign policy of the West. I'm very interested to talk to Myla and Fires about that, but of course, wherever you're watching, you can get in touch too. I'll speak to you in a minute.
Let me say something.
In Saudi Arabia, he's just got in touch to say he feels very sorry about what happened in the south of London. He says every Muslim he's talked to in Saudi is shocked about it, feels sorry. This extremist view is not one shared by the majority of Muslims, but nonetheless, extremism does exist. Radicalisation is happening, and so we're discussing why it's happening and how we might go about stopping it.
Talking about it.
I experience.
It's just chaos. People are going to want to know.
Let me say something.
No, I'm sure you didn't miss it. President Obama yesterday gave a very significant speech. He addressed the issue of America's use of drones, and he talked about Guantanamo Bay as well. Let's just see a little of what he told the audience.
Strikes have saved lives. Moreover, America's actions are legal. We were attacked on 9/11. Within a week, Congress overwhelmingly authorized the use of force. Under domestic law and international law, the United States is at war with al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and their associated forces.
And what's absolutely fascinating about what President Obama had to say was he said, even if everything I do and sanction is legal, it may not always be moral or wise. Let's talk about that with Myla and Fayez. Myla, that point is an interesting one. If something isn't moral, isn't wise, you risk, as the president said, creating enemies for yourself.
Yes, obviously our policy of using drones has been very controversial. We're saving American lives in terms of not putting boots on the ground, but we are also causing civilian casualties in the population of Pakistan, and that is, it's obvious that it is causing radicalization, and there's pushback within these communities that are experiencing the drone strikes.
Fayez?
I think the issue is that absolutely the US has got the legal right to defend itself, and Obama's absolutely right in that opinion. The factor, as Myla's just suggested here, is the way it comes across, the actions in communities, the deaths in communities, the innocents affected. It is that which provides the fuel to the ideology that actually gives it the impetus and momentum in some parts of Pakistan. Now, we have been out in Pakistan, we do work in Pakistan, we have spoken to individuals in the AfPak region, in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. And the fact of the matter is the drone issue is a major issue in Pakistan. It's become a political issue. And so what started off as a military tactic has become a major national and potentially international issue in that region. And it's being used by those ideologues to promote the fanaticism and to promote, not just the fanaticism, some nationalists in Pakistan. And there's a difference there. So those nationalists in Pakistan, of which there are many who feel pride in their country, to also feel sick at the use of drones in their country.
Myla?
And I want to follow up on that. He's exactly right. We are violating their national sovereignty in a way of Pakistan from the perspective of the average Pakistani. We are coming into their country and killing militants, which is our goal, but we have to think about what the consequences of those actions are. Are we killing one terrorist and radicalizing 10 witnesses to it? Where is the benefit? And I think that is what Obama was getting at, in a way, is that you are going to create the next generation of terrorists with these policies. While you may have the legal right to do so, the morality of it and what the costs are going to be need to be considered as well.
But Myla, don't you think the president was being naive in suggesting that he can sanction drone strikes where the risk of killing a civilian is almost zero? I mean, that kind of drone strike doesn't really exist, does it?
No, it doesn't. And the way they count the civilian casualties can be manipulated. If there's someone there, they can become a co-militant or a collaborator. So there's really, unless you are targeting a single car in the middle of Pakistan with nothing around, I mean, you're going to have the risk of civilian casualties. I think it is very naive to say that it's going to be zero or almost zero. You simply cannot guarantee that.
Well, we're talking about the tribal areas in northwest Pakistan. We're going to go to Pakistan in just a moment. First of all, though, I'll tell you that Collins is watching us in South Africa. Hi, Collins. Thanks for getting in touch. He says these kind of attacks, and he's talking about the attack in London, are preventable if you take time to watch the activities of groups of youths and try and break down segregation of ethnic groups. But the security services here in the UK have been monitoring an extensive amount of people, even the two suspects they were aware of. But how do you monitor every person you have some concerns about. As for breaking down segregation of ethnic groups, you'll know better than anyone, Collins, in South Africa, that is sometimes easier said than done. And Bilal in India says that Britain is paying the price for believing it would be safe. I'd question whether the British government ever put forward the idea that it could keep its people completely safe. It's just saying it is doing its very best, and it's impossible to monitor everyone. Well, let's go to Pakistan now and speak to Samira Shackle, who's a journalist live with us from Islamabad. Samira, do you accept that there are some circumstances where an American drone strike is perfectly justifiable in Pakistan?
Well, I think that's quite a difficult question. I mean, it comes down to what we're discussing, I think, which is the moral issue. And, you know, I think where you stand on the question of whether a drone strike, American drone strike on Pakistani soil is ever justifiable, comes down to where you stand, firstly, on extrajudicial killing, which is essentially what this is, on national sovereignty on those issues. And also, I think, personally, my main concern about drones is not an issue exclusive to Pakistan, it's the fact that it drastically lowers the bar at which warfare can be entered. And I think that's something which we should all be worried about globally. So while, you know, I think there's certainly an argument to be made for targeting known terrorist suspects rather than sort of declaring war on a whole region, I think we really do need to look at those sort of moral issues. And as the earlier speakers have been saying, the fact that there's absolutely no way you can guarantee there won't be civilian casualties.
Samira, thank you very much indeed. Sorry the line wasn't quite as good as we would like, but we appreciate you joining us. Subeda's back with us in Birmingham, and I'm curious to hear whether you reject the idea that this is about Islam. You say this is just about radicalisation primarily of young men. But do you think that the actions of the country you live in, the UK, are making your job harder? It's making it harder to stop radicalisation because of what's happening in Afghanistan and because of what happened in Iraq?
I think you can't actually, divorce the two and sort of say one without the other. Whether it makes something hard or not, you live with the kind of the reality of the situation that we're in. For example, I can't advise the British government to pull troops out of Afghanistan. So I use my democratic means, as do many hundreds and thousands of others, in terms of lobbying the government peacefully to do what we can do, and the government will either take note or it doesn't. That's a kind of political decision, and I think we work in that kind of in that reality of what it is. What we're trying to sort of say in terms of how we do things is not to go down the path of extremism, where we put the lives of innocent individuals at risk. So there is a distinction of being peaceful, and there is a distinction of being violent and killing someone. And, as citizens, we only have that duty, really, to our country.
Subeda, thank you very much indeed. Those of you watching, lots of you are getting in touch at the moment. I can see messages coming in from Sierra Leone, Angola, Nigeria, Belarus, France, Bangladesh and Spain. Those of you in Nigeria, I'm interested to talk about radicalisation. We know the problems that Nigeria is having with Boko Haram. How do you explain how young men are being radicalised in the north of your country? What are the things that are driving that radicalisation? You're very welcome to let us know. All the contact details are on the screen. Let's go back to Cody in Manchester. He served in the British Army in Afghanistan and in Bosnia. Cody, do you draw any wider conclusions about British society after this attack? Do you think there are problems with the way that people are integrating? Do you think there are problems with immigration, or do you just treat this as a one-off horrific murder?
To be honest, I think it's part of a much bigger picture, to be honest. I mean, there's obviously people out there that feel this strongly. And they apparently, they do it in the name of Islam. Now, we can't demonise all Muslims as terrorists and everything else, but these people that have got these radical views should be deported at the earliest opportunity, and that's not a racial thing. It's just the fact of another thing as well with this country is with the UK is the immigration in this country is so lax, and obviously the government are cutting numbers, obviously police and everything else. So it's probably the strongest time for these people with these radical views to, if they're not already over here, to come over here and carry out these abhorrent
Cody,
attacks.
let me just jump in there and bring in Myla and Subeda. I'd like to talk about this. Myla, do you think that Britain and America and other Western countries are too tolerant of people who espouse particularly radical views, anti-Western radical views, or is that part of the strength of countries like America that you can say those things?
I think that's part of the strength of America and the UK, is that we tolerate dissent and very vocal, fierce criticism of our policies. And that is the way our society is set up. It was one of our founding principles. And the extremism and the radicalization is not just on the Islamic side. I think it's important to look at, in the US, we have a growing right-wing movement, militia movement, guns, fearful of that the Second Amendment is going to be overturned, that have become more active and vocal. It's not just an Islamic or Muslim issue. This is an issue with society in general. And you have to be, if you're going to say we should deport people with these radical views, that cuts both ways. Are we also going to start deporting people who may advocate against our government I'm speaking from a US perspective of that the federal government is illegal. We have people called sovereign citizens here who reject the authority of the federal government.
And you're quite right. When the Boston attacks were happening, the two prime suspects, if you like, before we knew anything about the attackers, were it was either Muslim extremists or it was the people who reject the federal government in the States. Zubeda, what would you say to Cody about his concerns that people are able to remain and to help radicalize young men without this country intervening?
I think it's a very short and knee-jerk reaction when we start saying, you know, if you don't like it here, you can get out of here. And that really doesn't solve anything. I agree with the American lady who mentions, you know, the strength of our democracies, the strength of our kind of resilience lies in being free and having freedom to express views that we may not like and we may kind of agree with.
I can see Cody shaking his head. Cody, go ahead.
Right, with all due respect, there's a difference between freedom of speech and people standing on the streets of London in the UK preaching death to the Westerners and going out and blatantly, there is a huge difference between freedom of speech and preaching hatred to kill serving British soldiers. It's disgraceful, and these people on the line here that are saying these things and condoning that people should be allowed to try and radicalise on the streets of Britain. There's freedom of speech, and then there's actually saying, let's go out and let's kill that guy over there because he serves for his queen and country.
Well, Cody,
I've got two friends in Afghanistan.
I absolutely agree with you. I think it's distasteful, it's immoral, and I think we have to take a stance against it. And, you know, your concerns I do share with you. I've been confronted with some of these individuals myself. But if it's an absolute minority of individuals who have these absolutely horrible points of view, where do you draw the line? And my problem is not the fact that, you know, in terms of, I agree with what Cody is saying, the sentiment of what he's saying, but I disagree when you then have the far right coming into this discussion and sort of saying it's the immigrants and let's get rid of them because, you know, my family is from an immigrant stock as such. And so therefore we then start looking at people from a different, people who have different points of view, different coloured skin, different religion, and then it becomes part of that parcel of, and what we've seen from Woolwich is Islamophobia. So people who, mosques being attacked, for example, and people having lots of distasteful things being said to them. So it's kind of where that balance is in terms of being a freedom-loving country and also kind of being a democratic country, but then challenging where these abhorrent views come from as well.
Zubeda, Cody, thank you very much indeed. Myla, stay put. I've got a question for you, but I've got to go to a break. And those of you who are watching around the world, there's a lot of discussion here in the UK about whether it's possible to stop the kind of attacks which we saw on Wednesday from happening, or do we just have to accept that there will always be a certain level of risk? You can't monitor everyone. The experiences from your country would be interesting to hear. If you're tweeting, we're on the WHOS hashtag. We'll get into those issues in a couple of minutes' time here on the BBC.
No, I absolutely talking about it. Let me say something. No, I absolutely talking about it. Let me say something.
Welcome back to World Have Your Say. Let's go straight back to Myla. She's in Washington, D.C. She works for a think tank that specialises in understanding terrorism. I had to ask you one more question before you left. Do you really think that however President Obama tinkers with the drone policy, even closes Guantanamo Bay. Do you really think that will significantly alter the threat to America from Islamist terrorists?
No, I don't. I think Guantanamo has become a largely symbolic issue, and I think the effects of the drone policy, what Obama is talking about doing is subjecting it to additional openness and review. He's not talking about stopping it. He said when we pull out of Afghanistan that there will be less need for us to be involved in drone strikes in that country, but the real fronts are Pakistan and Yemen for the drone program. And I think as long as we continue those, we're going to continue to face that threat of creating the next generation of radicals.
Good to have you on the programme, Milo. Do come back on again. Now, the next couple of people I want to bring into our discussion here on the BBC are up in the World's Newsroom. Dawood's with the BBC Afghan Service. Hi, Dawood. What would you like to add?
Sorry, can you say it again? I couldn't hear you.
I just wondered what you've got for us. What do you want to add?
Oh, yeah, on Guantanamo, you asked a question about Guantanamo, whether it would help to earn some, to promote a good image of the U.S. if it is closed. I think it would, because a lot of ex-detainees of Guantanamo, who are mainly from Afghanistan, when they were released, some of them have written books and some of them are giving speeches about the treatment they received. And that has also radicalized a lot of people. And one of the book, which is in Pashto, actually became a bestseller. And it was translated into many other languages, including French.
So it sounds like, Dawood, that almost the damage has been done with Guantanamo, regardless of whether it's been shut. I'm going to leave it there only because I've got a couple of guests I want to get to. Many thanks to you and your colleagues for helping me today. Let's bring in now Robert Fox from the London Evening Standard, Defence and Security Editor for the paper. Do you agree with the Minister, Michael Gove? Do you agree with the Minister, Eric Pickles, who said you can't stop every threat? It's not possible to monitor everyone.
That's just the blindingly obvious, isn't it? I don't think it's stated nearly clearly enough on the BBC, which you seem to be expecting all is good or all is best in the best of all possible worlds. It's very interesting. I came into the BBC very early on yesterday morning, and the second question I was asked, this has been, and it was done as a rhetorical question, this has been an intelligence failure. The complexity of the intelligence picture, the means that the public is prepared to provide for it, they don't match. And you cannot rule out these things. We are, as a lot of your contributors have been saying, we're in a very much more complex landscape than we may know. And by the way, I disagree with my colleague who said that drones are predicated largely on Pakistan, to some extent Afghanistan and Yemen. I think we're going to see the use of drones overtly and covertly increasingly and very, very soon.
So just very quickly, if there was enough money, could the relevant surveillance be done? Is it just about funding?
No, it couldn't.
No.
No, it couldn't, because it's not just a question of quantity, it's a question of quality. And as I said, unless you had something that sort of existed in the middle days of the Roman Empire, a total information surveillance police regime, you could possibly do it. We're talking about a mass society now and a hypermass society. We're talking about a Great Britain in a relatively squeezed geographical area, which is going to a population of 70 billion, very, very complex, as we know, in terms of ethnicity, cultural origins, cultural loyalties. And it is very, very difficult indeed. And it is managing the balance of openness and vigilance, which is the real question.
Yours is the last comment on World Have Your Say. Thanks for coming on. Apologies to Al Qasim, who we're just not going to have a chance to get to. Hopefully, again, we'll be able to speak to him. And all of you who've got in touch, I've got a very long list of countries where we've heard from. Thank you very much. Back at the same time next week. Goodbye.
Let's just say something.